Have you ever noticed how control rarely begins with force? Because most of the time it starts with kindness, concern, small favors, and loving voices that slowly make you question whether saying no would make you seem difficult or ungrateful. And that's exactly how it began with my children, not through arguments, not through threats, but through help, endless help. Have you ever realized how dangerous help becomes once nobody asks whether you actually need it? Because that realization changed everything for me. At first, nothing felt unusual. Honestly, another mother might have even appreciated the extra attention. My son started visiting more often after I slipped slightly while carrying groceries one afternoon. It wasn't serious. I didn't even fall completely. But somehow, that tiny moment changed the entire atmosphere around me. Have you ever noticed how quickly one vulnerable moment can permanently change the way people see you? Because after that day, my children no longer looked at me the same way. Suddenly, they became deeply concerned about everything: my groceries, my driving, my medications, my schedule. Every conversation now carried the same careful tone underneath it all, as though I had quietly become fragile overnight. Have you ever felt people slowly replacing trust with supervision? Because that's exactly what started happening inside my life. At first, I tried appreciating it. Families worry, that's normal. I told myself they were only trying to protect me because they loved me, and maybe part of that was true. But love becomes complicated once it starts removing your choices one piece at a time. Have you ever realized control almost always arrives disguised as protection first? Because that understanding changes how certain words feel forever. My daughter began calling daily to check in, again, harmless on the surface, but the calls slowly changed from conversations into monitoring. What time did I wake up? Had I eaten? Did I take medication? Was I planning to drive anywhere? Have you ever noticed how quickly concern turns into accountability? Because that shift changes relationships more than people realize. Then came the help with errands. My son insisted grocery shopping was too exhausting for me now. My daughter offered to handle bills online to make things easier. Every offer sounded loving, thoughtful, responsible. But slowly, something inside me began feeling uncomfortable. Have you ever accepted help while secretly feeling pieces of your independence disappearing? Because that contradiction becomes exhausting over time. The strangest part was this: nobody asked what I wanted anymore. Decisions simply started happening around me naturally, as though everyone silently agreed I needed management now. Have you ever realized people can slowly step into control of your life without officially announcing it? Because that realization changes how safe ordinary moments feel. One afternoon, my son rearranged my kitchen while I sat in the living room. Cabinets changed, plates moved, medication organized differently. And when I told him calmly I preferred things the way they were before, he laughed gently and said, "Mom, we're just trying to help." Help. That word again, have you ever noticed how impossible it feels to argue against help without sounding unreasonable? Because that's what made this situation so confusing emotionally. I started second guessing myself constantly after that. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I should simply appreciate having children who cared enough to be involved. But deep down, something still felt wrong. Have you ever felt uncomfortable even while everyone around you insisted things were fine? Because intuition notices changes long before the mind fully understands them. Then came the doctor appointments. That's when everything started feeling heavier. My daughter insisted on attending just in case I forgot anything important. Just in case. Have you ever realized how small phrases quietly change the way people see you? Because suddenly I wasn't simply going to appointments anymore, I was being supervised through them. During one visit, the doctor asked me a simple question about medications, and before I could even answer fully, my daughter interrupted to explain everything herself. I remember sitting there quietly while two people discussed my health as though I wasn't fully capable of speaking for myself anymore. Have you ever had someone slowly take over your voice while smiling kindly at you? Because that humiliation settles deeper than anger. Afterward, I tried mentioning gently that I preferred answering questions myself. My daughter immediately looked hurt. "We're only trying to help you," she said softly. There it was again, help. Have you ever noticed how guilt becomes part of control once people convince you their behavior is love? Because that guilt kept silencing me. Slowly, the balance inside my family changed completely. My children no longer acted like they were assisting me temporarily. They started acting like they were responsible for me now. And perhaps the most painful part was this: they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Have you ever realized people can slowly remove your independence while convincing themselves they're protecting you? Because that realization terrified me more than I wanted to admit. One evening during dinner, I forgot the name of a restaurant we used to visit years ago. Just one small memory lapse, a normal human moment, but suddenly the table became strangely quiet afterward. My son and daughter exchanged a quick look they thought I didn't notice. And in that tiny silent moment, something inside me shifted completely. Have you ever seen people silently agree on something about you without saying it out loud? Because that glance told me more than words ever could. Later that night, as I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, I overheard my son quietly say something from the kitchen that stopped me cold. We may need to start getting more involved before things get worse. Worse. Have you ever heard people discussing your future like you were already becoming incapable? Because standing there in that dark hallway, listening silently outside the kitchen, I realized something terrifying for the very first time. My children no longer saw their behavior as temporary help anymore. They were slowly preparing to take control of my life, and the next thing they helped me with made me realize I was losing far more than my independence. Have you ever realized there's a moment when help quietly stops being support and starts becoming control? Because the most dangerous kind of control doesn't arrive through force. It arrives through routines, through repeated concern, through small decisions made for you so often that eventually everyone forgets they were supposed to be your decisions in the first place. And that's exactly what began happening after I overheard my son talking about getting more involved before things got worse. Worse. That word stayed in my mind constantly afterward. Have you ever noticed how certain words can completely change the way you see people? Because after hearing that conversation, I started paying attention differently. And the more I observed, the more unsettling everything became. My children's behavior changed quickly after that night, not aggressively, calmly, casually, which somehow made it feel even heavier. Have you ever noticed how easy it is for people to normalize controlling behavior when they disguise it as care? Because little by little, that's exactly what happened inside my life. My daughter started managing my appointments completely now. Instead of asking what worked best for me, she simply informed me when things were scheduled. I moved your appointment to Thursday. I already talked to the office for you. Such small sentences. Such huge changes underneath them. Have you ever realized people can slowly remove your authority over your own life without ever officially announcing it? Because that realization changes how every conversation feels. Then came the finances. That's when I truly started feeling trapped emotionally. My son casually mentioned one afternoon how stressful it must be for me to keep track of bills, paperwork, and accounts at this stage of life. At this stage of life. Have you ever noticed how people quietly reduce your identity to your age once they start seeing you as dependent? Because those phrases linger in your mind long afterward. He offered to simplify things by helping organize accounts online. Again, another harmless offer on the surface. But underneath it lived the same dangerous assumption growing stronger every day that eventually I would no longer be capable of managing my own affairs. Have you ever realized people often prepare for control emotionally long before they ask for it practically? Because that understanding changed everything for me. And still, every time I felt uncomfortable, guilt followed immediately afterward. Maybe I should feel grateful. Maybe they were genuinely trying to make life easier for me. That confusion became exhausting. Have you ever doubted your own instincts because everyone around you insisted their behavior was love? Because that emotional conflict kept me silent far longer than it should have. Then came the car keys. That moment changed everything. One afternoon, after a routine appointment, my daughter casually suggested maybe I should avoid driving for a while because traffic had become stressful lately. I calmly explained I was perfectly fine driving myself, and technically that should have ended the conversation. But it didn't, because by then this was no longer about driving, it was about authority. Have you ever noticed people keep pushing after you already gave an answer because they stopped viewing your answer as final? Because that realization terrified me. A few days later, my son asked where my spare car key was just in case of emergencies. Just in case. Those words again, always temporary, always reasonable sounding. But temporary control has a way of becoming permanent very quietly. Have you ever realized freedom is rarely taken all at once, but slowly enough that resisting feels selfish? Because that's exactly how this happened. At first, I handed over the spare key without much thought, Families share emergency contacts. That seemed normal enough, but almost immediately afterward, something shifted. Suddenly, every time I mentioned leaving the house, questions followed. Where are you going? Do you really need to drive today? Wouldn't it be easier if one of us took you? Have you ever realized people can turn simple independence into something requiring approval? Because that feeling changes you deeply. Then one morning, I discovered my main car key missing from the bowl near the front door. I searched the kitchen twice before my son calmly explained he had taken it temporarily because everyone worried about me driving alone lately. Temporarily, there was that word again. Have you ever had something taken from you so politely that arguing almost made you feel unreasonable? Because sitting there listening to him explain this calmly felt surreal. I tried objecting gently at first. I explained I was still fully capable, still careful, still independent, but every sentence I spoke seemed to increase their concern instead of reducing it. Have you ever noticed how once people decide you need supervision, defending yourself somehow becomes proof to them that they're right, because that trap feels impossible to escape emotionally? And then my son said something that stayed with me long afterward. Mom, you need to trust us to make good decisions for you now. For you now. Have you ever heard someone quietly announce that your authority over your own life no longer fully belongs to you? Because that sentence changed everything for me. Something inside me shifted after hearing those words. Quietly, deeply, not anger, clarity. Because for the first time, I realized this situation had moved beyond ordinary family concern completely. My children no longer saw themselves as helping me occasionally. They saw themselves as responsible for managing my life. Have you ever realized people can slowly replace your independence with permission while still calling it love? Because that realization changes trust forever. Later that night, sitting alone in the quiet house without my car keys beside the front door anymore, I replayed every strange moment from the past few months differently now. The interruptions, the supervision, the concern, the decisions already made before asking me. And slowly, painfully, one terrifying truth became impossible to ignore. My children no longer believed they were helping me temporarily. They were slowly taking ownership over my future. And the next conversation I overheard made me realize they weren't just helping anymore. They were already discussing how much control they should have over my life next. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing about losing control of your life is how quietly people begin making plans around you? Because once someone believes they're responsible for you, conversations start happening without you, decisions start forming behind closed doors. And suddenly your future becomes something other people discuss while you sit in the next room unaware. Or at least that's what my children believed was happening to me. They thought I wasn't noticing anymore. That was their biggest mistake. Have you ever noticed how quickly people stop being careful once they underestimate your awareness? Because that carelessness became my greatest advantage. After my son took my car keys, something inside me changed completely. Until then, part of me still hoped I was overreacting, imagining things, becoming too emotional about ordinary family concern. But after hearing him say I needed to trust them to make decisions for me, I stopped doubting my instincts. Have you ever realized your intuition often understands the truth long before your heart is ready to accept it? Because that realization changed how I moved through the house afterward. I became quieter, more observant, less reactive emotionally, and because of that, my children relaxed around me even more. Have you ever let people underestimate you simply so they would reveal who they really were? Because silence became my strongest weapon. The whispered conversations increased after that. I noticed them constantly now. Voices lowering when I entered rooms, phone calls ending too quickly, sudden topic changes during dinner. At first, I tried convincing myself families simply discuss concerns privately sometimes, but deep down, I already knew better. Have you ever entered a room and immediately felt like you interrupted the real conversation? Because that feeling creates loneliness inside your own home. One evening, I woke up after falling asleep on the couch and heard voices drifting from the kitchen. My son and daughter were speaking softly, believing I was still asleep nearby. Normally, I would have ignored it, but then I heard my name. Have you ever heard your name spoken quietly and instantly known something wasn't right because that moment stopped me cold? I stayed still listening while my son talked about future arrangements. Future arrangements, such polite words for something that suddenly felt terrifying. My daughter sounded hesitant at first, asking whether they were moving too fast. Too fast with what? Have you ever listened to people discuss your future while realizing you're not part of the conversation anymore? because that realization changes everything. Then my son said something that stayed with me long afterward. We need to be realistic about where this is heading. Realistic. Have you ever noticed how people use calm, practical language to justify taking control? Because those words suddenly connected every strange feeling I'd been carrying for months. The conversation slowly shifted toward finances after that: bills, accounts, simplifying things, making sure mom is protected. Such careful phrases, such dangerous meaning underneath them. Have you ever realized control almost always hides behind reasonable explanations? Because that understanding terrified me deeply. And then came the sentence that changed everything. My son quietly said, "It'll be easier once we officially start handling more for her." Officially. Have you ever heard someone discuss taking over parts of your life like it was only a matter of time? Because standing there silently in the dark hallway, I realized this wasn't temporary concern anymore. My children were emotionally preparing for authority over my future. The scariest part was this: they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your independence while convincing themselves they're protecting you? Because that realization hurts differently than anger. I stayed quiet after overhearing that conversation. That part mattered, because if they realized I understood what was happening, they would become careful. And right now, they were still exposing too much. Have you ever stayed silent simply because silence gave you access to the truth? Because that silence became my greatest advantage. Over the following days, I noticed even more changes. My daughter asking detailed questions about legal paperwork just in case. My son becoming strangely interested in financial documents he never cared about before. Even simple conversations now carried hidden evaluation underneath them, almost like they were constantly measuring how capable I still seemed. Have you ever felt observed by the people who are supposed to trust you? Because that feeling changes how safe your family feels forever. But strangely enough, instead of feeling helpless after hearing those conversations, I started feeling clearer, stronger, because uncertainty had disappeared now. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity becomes once denial finally ends? Because now I finally understood exactly what was happening around me. My children no longer saw themselves as helping me occasionally. They saw themselves as preparing to manage me permanently. And because they believed I wasn't fully aware anymore, they stopped hiding their intentions carefully. Have you ever watched people become careless simply because they thought they already had control? Because their confidence became my opportunity. One afternoon, while putting away laundry upstairs, I accidentally discovered something tucked inside a folder on the guest room desk: financial forms, legal information, notes about future authority planning. My hands shook reading the words. Have you ever found proof of something you desperately hoped wasn't real? Because that moment changed everything. Suddenly, every whisper, every hidden conversation, every helpful decision connected together perfectly. This wasn't just concern anymore. They were preparing for control officially, quietly, legally, and the most dangerous part, they believed I was too weak to stop it. But while my children quietly prepared to take control of my futures, I had already started planning something they never expected me capable of doing. What if the biggest mistake people can make is believing you've already given up? Because once someone thinks you're powerless, they stop paying attention carefully. They stop questioning your silence, and eventually they reveal far more than they ever intended to. And that's exactly what started happening after I discovered those papers hidden inside the guest room folder. My children believed I was becoming dependent, confused, easier to guide, but what they didn't realize was this: the quieter I became externally, the more alert I became internally. Have you ever noticed how dangerous silence becomes once people underestimate the person staying quiet? Because that silence became my greatest weapon. After finding the paperwork, I carefully returned every document exactly where I found it. That part mattered because the moment my children realized I knew what they were planning, everything would change. They would become cautious, defensive, harder to read, and right now, their confidence was still exposing the truth naturally. Have you ever stayed calm simply because the truth mattered more than emotional confrontation? Because that became my strategy completely. I stopped arguing about little things after that. I stopped pushing back every time someone corrected me unnecessarily or questioned my decisions. And because of that, my family relaxed around me even more. Have you ever watched people lower their guard completely because they believed they already controlled the situation? Because that confidence changed everything in my favor. My son especially had become comfortable now. The hesitation he once carried during conversations about my life had disappeared almost completely. He spoke with calm authority now, discussing my future like someone already responsible for it. Have you ever noticed how quickly help transforms into ownership once nobody challenges it? Because that shift changes relationships permanently. One evening during dinner, he casually mentioned how much easier things had become since the family started handling more responsibilities for me, handling responsibilities. Such polite language for taking away someone's independence piece by piece. Have you ever realized people often describe control differently once they convince themselves it's justified? Because that realization stayed with me long afterward. But instead of reacting emotionally, I simply nodded calmly and listened. And that's when I noticed something important. Nobody around the table questioned his authority anymore. The entire family had quietly adjusted to the idea that my independence was temporary now. Have you ever realized how quickly people normalize your loss of freedom once they emotionally accept a new version of you? Because normalization makes control feel invisible. Meanwhile, I quietly started preparing my own plans behind their backs, not emotionally, strategically. Have you ever noticed how clarity changes the way you think completely? Because once I fully understood what my children were preparing for, fear slowly disappeared. In its place came focus. I began organizing things privately, important documents, financial details, personal records. Information my family assumed I either forgot about or no longer fully understood. And that assumption gave me room to move quietly. Have you ever realized underestimated people often become the most dangerous because nobody sees them preparing? Because that underestimation became my advantage, I also started paying attention to timing. That mattered more than anything. When my children visited, when conversations happened, which topics suddenly disappeared when I entered rooms. Slowly, patterns began revealing even more truth than words themselves. Have you ever realized people expose their real intentions through consistency? Because consistency never lies for long. One afternoon, I overheard my son on the phone speaking about me again. His tone was calm, practical, almost businesslike. He mentioned transitioning responsibilities gradually and making sure everything is legally protected before confusion gets worse. Worse. That word again, have you ever noticed how people repeat certain labels often enough until they stop sounding cruel to themselves? Because hearing him speak that way about me changed something permanently inside me. But strangely enough, instead of feeling helpless after overhearing that conversation, I felt stronger. Because every careless sentence confirmed exactly what I already suspected. This was no longer ordinary family concern. My children had emotionally prepared themselves to take control over my future completely. Have you ever realized the scariest kind of betrayal comes from people who truly believe they're helping you? Because that realization hurts deeper than anger ever could, and still I stayed calm. That part mattered. Every time they expected emotional resistance and didn't receive it, their confidence grew stronger, their guard lowered further. And that gave me exactly what I needed: time. Have you ever known something that could completely change a situation and quietly waited for the perfect moment to reveal it? Because that's exactly where I was now. One evening, while my daughter organized paperwork in the kitchen, I noticed another folder sitting partially open near the counter. This time, I didn't even need to read much before understanding what I was seeing. Discussions about future authority, long-term financial management, living arrangements, real plans, not hypothetical conversations anymore. Have you ever realized people stopped discussing possibilities and started preparing certainty instead? Because that realization changes everything. Sitting alone in my bedroom later that night, replaying every conversation, every whisper, every hidden document differently now, I finally understood something important. My children thought I was slowly losing control of my life, but in reality, I was quietly taking it back without them noticing. And while they believed I was too weak to stop what they were planning, I had already started preparing the move that would destroy their entire plan completely. Because the next call I secretly made behind my children's backs changed the entire balance of power inside the family forever. What happens when the person everyone quietly underestimated stops reacting emotionally and starts preparing strategically instead? Because there's something dangerous about assuming someone is powerless. You stop imagining they're capable of protecting themselves. And that's exactly what my children failed to realize while they spent months planning control over my future behind closed doors. They believed I was becoming weaker every day. But secretly, I had already started taking my power back. Have you ever realized people often become most vulnerable the moment they think they've already won? Because that confidence became my greatest advantage. After discovering the second folder in the kitchen, I stopped doubting myself completely. That part mattered. Until then, some small part of me still wanted to believe this situation was simply fear mixed with overprotectiveness. But now the truth was impossible to ignore. My children weren't just discussing possibilities anymore. They were actively preparing for authority over my life. Have you ever realized there's a difference between helping someone and quietly replacing them? Because that realization changed everything for me. And strangely enough, once I fully accepted the truth, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling afraid completely. Have you ever noticed how clarity removes fear once uncertainty finally disappears? Because now I understood exactly what I was dealing with: the whispers, the paperwork, the constant supervision. The way every conversation slowly moved toward future planning. None of it was accidental anymore. This was coordinated, gradual, intentional. Have you ever realized people can slowly build control around you while pretending nothing serious is happening? Because that understanding made me more careful than ever. I stayed exactly the same externally after that: calm, cooperative, quiet. I allowed my children to believe they still controlled the situation completely. And because of that, they became even more comfortable, even more careless. Have you ever let people underestimate you because it gave you time to prepare privately? Because that silence became my strongest weapon. Then one morning, while my daughter sat in the kitchen making coffee, I quietly made the call that changed everything. My hands shook dialing the number, not from confusion, not from weakness, from clarity. Have you ever made a decision that instantly changed how powerless you felt? Because that moment changed something deep inside me immediately. I contacted someone completely outside the family, independent, professional. Someone whose opinion couldn't be emotionally manipulated by whispers, assumptions, or good intentions. And for the first time in months, I felt heard instead of managed. Have you ever realized how different it feels when someone speaks to you directly instead of speaking around you? Because that difference nearly made me emotional. I explained everything carefully: the memory concerns, the paperwork, the conversations, the increasing pressure disguised as help, and most importantly, the growing feeling that my children no longer trusted me to control my own life. Have you ever finally said something out loud after carrying it silently for months? Because hearing the truth spoken clearly changed everything for me. The response shocked me more than anything else. Calmly, professionally, I was told something nobody in my family had bothered reminding me of in a very long time. I still had rights, full authority, full independence unless proven otherwise properly and fairly. Have you ever realized how powerful it feels when someone finally treats you like a capable adult again? Because after months of being supervised, corrected, and quietly doubted, that moment felt almost overwhelming emotionally. I started quietly organizing my own protections after that call: legal advice, financial reviews, documentation, independent evaluations if necessary, every step carefully planned, every move completely private. And because my children still believed I was passive and confused, they never noticed any of it happening. Have you ever realized the people underestimating you often stop watching carefully enough? Because that mistake changed everything in my favor. Meanwhile, my family continued growing more confident. Dinner conversations became increasingly open about future responsibilities. My son casually discussed when things become more difficult later. My daughter started mentioning long-term care planning more directly now. They genuinely believed the future already belonged to them emotionally. Have you ever noticed how expectations slowly become entitlement once people stop questioning their own assumptions? Because entitlement changes behavior fast. Then came the dinner that changed everything completely. My son brought paperwork to the table again, speaking gently, patiently, carefully, the same tone people use with someone they no longer see as fully capable mentally. He explained these were simple arrangements designed to make life easier moving forward, easier for everyone. Have you ever listened to someone disguise authority as convenience? Because that's exactly what was happening. Everyone around the table watched me quietly now, waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting confusion, expecting dependence. But what they didn't know was this: while they spent months building a story about my weakness, I had already built my own protection behind their backs. Have you ever known a moment was about to change everything, before anyone else in the room realized it yet? because sitting there looking down at those papers, I understood something clearly. My children still believed they were in control of this situation, but they had no idea the woman they called confused had already taken back her power long before this dinner even began. And the moment I finally revealed the truth at that dinner table, the entire family went completely silent. What if the person everyone quietly treated like she was losing her mind turned out to be the only person in the room who truly understood what was happening? Because there's something shocking about watching a carefully built narrative collapse in real time. And that's exactly what happened the night my children finally realized I was never as powerless or as confused as they convinced themselves I had become. The dinner table felt unusually tense that evening, not openly tense, controlled tense, the kind of atmosphere where everyone believes an important moment is coming, but nobody says it out loud directly. Have you ever sat in a room where people were emotionally waiting for your answer before you even spoke? Because that's exactly how it felt sitting there looking down at those papers. My son pushed the document slightly closer toward me and smiled gently, patiently, carefully, the same careful tone again. He explained these arrangements were just temporary protections designed to make things easier if my memory problems became more serious later. More serious later. Have you ever noticed how people slowly turn assumptions into facts simply by repeating them often enough? Because by then, my family no longer spoke about my confusion like a possibility. They spoke about it like an inevitable future already arriving. Everyone around the table watched me quietly now, waiting for hesitation, waiting for emotional confusion, waiting for compliance. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I realized just how deeply they believed the story they created about me. Have you ever seen people become emotionally attached to a version of you that no longer feels fully human? Because that realization hurt more than I expected. But instead of panicking, I felt calm, very calm, because while my children spent months preparing for this moment, I had already prepared for it too. Have you ever noticed how powerful preparation feels when nobody else realizes you've been planning quietly? Because that calmness changed everything for me. I looked down at the paperwork for several seconds before finally asking one simple question. Why would I sign authority documents after what my attorney explained to me? Silence, complete silence. Have you ever watched confidence disappear from someone's face instantly? Because that's exactly what happened around that table. My son froze, my daughter stared at me without speaking, and suddenly the atmosphere inside the room changed completely, not because I shouted, not because I accused anyone dramatically, but because for the first time they realized I understood everything. Have you ever seen people suddenly recognize they underestimated you completely? Because that realization is impossible to hide. I stayed calm after that. Calmness mattered now more than ever. I explained quietly that after discovering the paperwork and overhearing conversations over the past few months, I had contacted independent legal and medical professionals privately. Real professionals, independent advice, independent evaluation, independent protection. Everything they believed I was too confused to manage on my own, I had already handled successfully behind their backs. Have you ever realized the people questioning your capability often panic most when you prove them wrong? Because that panic filled the room completely now. The questions came immediately afterward, too quickly, too emotionally. Why would I contact attorneys? Why didn't I trust the family? Why involve outsiders? But underneath every question sat the same truth. They were no longer discussing my confusion anymore. They were scrambling because the control they thought they were building had suddenly disappeared. Have you ever noticed how quickly manipulation falls apart once the person being controlled sees everything clearly? Because clarity destroys false narratives instantly. I explained something calmly that nobody around that table seemed prepared to hear. I said forgetting small things does not erase a lifetime of intelligence. Aging does not remove someone's right to dignity, and concern does not give anyone permission to quietly prepare authority over another person's life without honesty and respect first. Have you ever realized how powerful your voice becomes once people finally stop dismissing it? Because for the first time in months, nobody interrupted me, nobody corrected me, nobody spoke for me. The room had changed too completely now. My son looked shaken afterward, truly shaken, because suddenly he wasn't looking at the confused version of me they built emotionally over months. He was seeing the real me again, clear, aware. Watching everything the entire time. Have you ever watched someone realize they stopped seeing you clearly long before you noticed it yourself? Because that realization changes relationships forever. And perhaps the hardest part for my family was this: they now understood I had heard far more than they ever intended me to hear. The whispers, the assumptions, the conversations about taking over more responsibility, the future planning. The paperwork, all of it. Have you ever realized betrayal hurts differently when it happens slowly inside ordinary family moments? Because sitting there at that table, I could feel the weight of every quiet humiliation from the past few months finally settling over the room. But strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free, truly free, because after months of being treated like someone losing her voice, I had finally reclaimed it completely. And now, for the first time in a very long time, my children were finally listening instead of managing. But what my son admitted after the truth finally came out hurt more than every whisper and hidden conversation combined. What hurts more than being treated like you're confused is realizing the people doing it slowly stopped seeing who you really are, because the deepest kind of betrayal isn't always cruelty, it's erasure. It's watching the people who once trusted your wisdom begin questioning your voice, your judgment, your independence, until one day you barely recognize the version of yourself they created inside their minds. And that painful truth became impossible to ignore after my family finally realized I had understood everything all along. The room stayed quiet after I finished speaking that night, not tense silence anymore, heavy silence, reflective silence, the kind that appears when people suddenly see their own behavior differently for the first time. Have you ever watched people realize the story they believed about you was never fully true, because that realization sat across the dinner table now? My daughter looked devastated. My son looked shaken in a way I had never seen before. And suddenly, for the first time in months, nobody was treating me like I was fragile anymore. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody corrected my words. Nobody exchanged worried glances while I spoke. They were finally listening. Truly listening. Have you ever noticed how quickly respect returns once people realize they can no longer control the conversation? Because that shift changed everything. But then my son quietly said something that hurt more than every hidden paper, every whispered conversation, every helpful decision combined. He looked at me and admitted, "We really thought you were starting to lose yourself." Lose yourself. Not just forgetful, not occasionally confused. Lose yourself. Have you ever heard the people closest to you quietly admit they stopped believing in your mind? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words barely touch. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. Not because I felt weak, but because suddenly I understood the real damage underneath everything that happened. This was never only about paperwork or authority, it was about identity. My children had slowly replaced the woman I truly was with a version easier for them to fear, protect, and eventually control emotionally. A confused older woman, fragile, dependent, easier to manage than trust. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your identity while still believing they love you completely? Because that realization changes relationships forever. My daughter started crying quietly after that, explaining they were scared. Scared something serious would happen before they prepared properly. Scared I would decline quickly and suffer because nobody stepped in early enough. And strangely enough, I believed her. That was the complicated part of everything. I truly believe fear existed inside my family, but fear mixed with authority becomes dangerous very quickly. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly destroy someone's dignity? Because that truth changed me permanently. I finally looked directly at my children and told them something I had been carrying inside me for months. I said forgetting small things does not erase a lifetime of intelligence. Aging does not remove someone's right to make decisions. And needing occasional help does not mean surrendering your voice, your choices, or your future completely. Have you ever realized dignity matters just as much as protection? Because that understanding became clearer to me than anything else during this entire experience. I also told them something harder to admit out loud. I said the most painful part wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the whispered conversations. It wasn't even the supervision. The most painful part was feeling invisible inside my own family, feeling like my words slowly stopped carrying weight. Have you ever realized how lonely it feels when people stop fully believing you? Because that loneliness changes you deeply. The room stayed quiet after that, but differently now. Honest quiet, no pretending anymore. No fake reassurance, just truth finally sitting openly between all of us. And strangely enough, that truth brought relief too, because for the first time in months, nobody was speaking about me like I wasn't fully present anymore. They were finally seeing me clearly again. Have you ever noticed how powerful it feels when people finally recognize your voice again after slowly taking it away? Because that recognition changes something deep inside you. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. That's important. This was never about humiliating my children or proving I was smarter than them. It was about reclaiming myself before I disappeared completely inside their fears, assumptions, and plans for my future. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing people can take from you isn't money or freedom, but credibility? Because once people stop trusting your mind, every part of your life becomes vulnerable afterward. Later that night, after everyone left and the house finally became quiet again, I sat alone thinking about how easily ordinary aging had slowly turned into something much bigger inside my family. One forgotten word, one repeated story, one misplaced pair of glasses, tiny moments that slowly became evidence inside a narrative I never agreed to, and suddenly I understood something deeply important. People may question your memory, they may underestimate your awareness, they may even convince themselves you no longer fully understand what's happening around you. But real wisdom, the kind built through experience, observation, survival, and self respect, is much harder to erase than people think. And while my children spent months treating me like I was confused, they never realized I was quietly seeing the truth more clearly than anyone else in the room. They thought I was losing myself, until the truth revealed they had stopped seeing me clearly all along.